Back in the day, we had ways of dazzling company, and it didn't take fresh lobster or imported cheese to do it. With a few pantry staples, a little imagination, and a flair for presentation, you could turn a regular get-together into a tasty memory. Here's how we did it. I know what you're thinking. Frankfurters? Fancy? But just you wait. Back when money was tight but pride was strong, moms had to get creative with how they presented their food. What we lacked in filet mignon, we made up for with a little flair. And a knack for making the humble hot dog look like it belonged at a royal banquet. The crown roast of Frankfurters is exactly what it sounds like. About a dozen hot dogs sliced partway through and arranged upright in a perfect circle. The slices would curl open when baked, forming a sort of crown shape. Majestic, in a way only the 1950s could dream up. It was all about illusion. You'd take a dozen or so Franks, make a few little slits at the ends, then stand them up in a circle, all tied together in the shape of a crown. Right in the center, you'd stuff it with mashed potatoes, baked beans, or even mac and cheese, depending on what you had on hand. Some folks added a sprig of parsley to dress it up. Others went full parade float with decorative toothpicks and pineapple rings. Whatever you put in there, the Franks would curl outward at the top like flower petals as they roasted in the oven. You could even stick little paper frills on the ends of the hot dogs, like those fancy caps you'd see on lamb chops in a magazine ad. The whole thing came out of the oven looking like it belonged in a department store window, even if it cost you less than a couple bucks. Taste-wise, it was hot dogs. It was salty, snappy, a little smoky if you got the right brand. But served up like that, guests didn't think about the cost. They saw effort. They saw a host who cared enough to try. It had this kitschy charm that made people smile. And for a couple bucks, you could feed a crowd and feel like a king while on a pauper's salary. Now, what's a crown roast without its crown jewel dessert? If you ever had it, you remember. This was the Jell-O showstopper, made all the kids wide-eyed and the ladies whisper praises. This one came straight out of the back of a craft recipe booklet, and it was pure mid-century magic. You'd start by making a bunch of different colored Jell-O and set each one in a flat pan. Once they were firm, you'd cube them up into little jewels. Then you fold those colorful cubes into a mix of lemon Jell-O and whipped evaporated milk. Just as it was starting to set, pour that into a mold, pop it in the fridge overnight, and what you got the next day was a shimmering mosaic of bright colors suspended in creamy lemon fluff. When you sliced into it, it looked like stained glass in a church window. It was light and sweet, sometimes tropical in taste, with that familiar Jell-O wobble, and again, cheap as sin. A couple boxes of Jell-O, a can of milk, and you had a centerpiece. But boy, did it look like something you'd see in a hotel buffet. I used to ask for seconds even if I didn't particularly like Jell-O, just so I could marvel at it again. Funny thing is, none of it was gourmet, not one bit. But guests were fascinated by it because it looked like a stained glass sculpture and cost less than a box of donuts. It was easy to make ahead, easy to serve, and always got compliments, especially from the ladies at Bridge Club or the cousins at Easter. And for a generation that valued showmanship at the dinner table, something that looked this flashy but didn't break the bank was a godsend. Porcupine meatballs were a Depression-era classic that stuck around well into the 50s and 60s. No matter how you spun it, they were meatballs. But they were so visually striking that you didn't even think about how cheap they actually were. Ground beef was mixed with uncooked white rice, a dash of onion, some canned tomato soup, and some Worcestershire sauce. Then shaped into balls and simmered low and slow in more tomato soup or a tangy sauce. When they cooked, the rice puffed up and poked through the surface of the meat, sticking out like little quills. That's how they got their name. They weren't just tasty, they looked like something you would serve up on a special day, especially to kids or company who hadn't seen them before. My mom used to plate them over mashed potatoes or egg noodles if that's what we had, and they'd sit there plump, saucy, and proud. Porcupine meatballs were hearty and tangy. The tomato soup gave it that sweet sour twang we all grew up on. The rice made them tender, stretched the meat further, and gave them a kind of rustic chew that felt filling. They stuck to your ribs without burning through your wallet. They were always able to wow your guests because they were clever. You took 1 pound of meat and made it feed 6, and you gave it a name that sounded like a dish out of a Dr. Seuss storybook. It had personality, and when budgets were tight and meat was precious, turning it into something fun and filling was its own labor of love. If that wasn't attention-grabbing enough for you, here's a dish that walked into the room and owned it. Baked Alaska was both a dessert and a spectacle. You served it when you really wanted to dazzle. Birthdays, anniversaries, the boss coming for dinner, this was your showpiece. Most times, it started with a base of plain yellow sponge cake. On top of that went a mound of ice cream, often molded into a dome shape. Once frozen solid, you'd slather the whole thing in whipped meringue. Make sweet, stiff peaks of egg white and sugar, and either torch it or bake it quickly in a hot oven just long enough to toast the outside. You'd cut into this warm, toasted shell, and inside was still ice cold. Frozen, creamy ice cream sitting on soft cake. That play of hot and cold, soft and crisp, made it unforgettable. Baked Alaska didn't come from a humble origin. It was a 19th century invention, with versions showing up in French kitchens and American restaurants as early as the 1860s. But by the 1950s and 60s, it had been adapted for home cooks thanks to better freezers and the rise of meringue in American baking culture. It became the go-to fancy dessert in a home kitchen. But make no mistake, this wasn't a dessert you could dilly-dally with. You had to plan ahead, and you had to have the timing right. It cost a bit more than Jell-O thanks to the store-bought ice cream, eggs, and cake mix, but it still beat a bakery bill. This was the party piece for the bridge club, baby showers, or Sunday luncheons when the ladies were coming over, and you wanted something that looked more impressive than it really was. At its heart, the frosted sandwich loaf was just a stack of sandwiches, but dressed up like a cake. To make it, take a loaf of white sandwich bread, crusts cut off, of course, and slice it horizontally into layers. Each layer got a different filling: chicken salad, egg salad, ham spread, maybe even olive and cream cheese. Once stacked, the whole loaf was frosted with whipped cream cheese, sometimes tinted pastel pink or green with a drop of food coloring, and decorated with olives, pimentos, parsley, or cucumber slices arranged like flowers on top. When the host brought it out, people did a double take. It looked like a cake, but one slice in revealed that neat rainbow of savory layers inside. Served cold on a platter with frilly toothpicks, and maybe some Ritz crackers on the side, it was as much centerpiece as it was meal. The idea sprang from tea sandwich traditions in Europe, but took on a life of its own in American kitchens from the 1940s into the 60s. It was all about visual trickery and thrifty elegance, taking sandwich fixings and turning them into a sculpted, edible centerpiece. How it tasted depended on the fillings, but generally it was soft, creamy, salty, lots of mayo, pickles, and deli meat flavors. Not gourmet, but satisfying in that old-timey luncheonette sort of way. This thing looked like you'd spent hours on it, even though it was mostly assembly. For the cost of a loaf of bread, a few canned meats, and a block of cream cheese, you got something that looked like it belonged in a ladies' magazine. Millionaire pie sounded expensive and fancy, when in reality, it was anything but. This thing is Southern hospitality in a graham cracker crust. No baking, no fuss. Just cool, creamy sweetness piled high and tasting like a slice of summer. It started with a graham cracker or vanilla wafer crust, filled with crushed pineapple, sweetened condensed milk, Cool Whip, and chopped pecans or walnuts. Some recipes added maraschino cherries or shredded coconut, The whole thing was chilled until it set, then served in tall slices. It looked luxurious, all fluffy and golden, sometimes with a cherry on top or a sprinkle of extra nuts. That soft, creamy filling dotted with fruit and nuts had a bit of a sparkle to it, especially with the gleam of pineapple and the crunch of pecans. It was rich but refreshing to have in your mouth. The pie got sweet and tangy from the pineapple, creamy from the condensed milk, and light thanks to the whipped topping. The name Millionaire Pie came from how decadent it seemed, not how much it cost, because in truth, this was cheap as dirt pantry magic. Everything came from a can, a tub, or a box. It came into fashion in the South around the 1950s and spread fast thanks to church potlucks, family reunions, and community cookbooks. The no-bake aspect made it perfect for warm weather or for cooks who didn't want to heat up the house. It looked like a pie you'd buy at a bakery, but it was made with grocery store basics. It had just enough sweetness and creaminess to make people ask for seconds. And the name helped sell it too. Serve something called Millionaire Pie. And folks think they're living in the lap of luxury, even if you only spent $5 to make the whole thing. Cherries. Jubilee was a dessert with drama. You served it after you performed it. For the uninitiated, it's a combination of deep red cherries cooked in a syrupy sauce of sugar and cherry juice, and a splash of lemon, then flambéed in brandy or kirsch, and poured over vanilla ice cream right at the table. That flicker of blue flame was the moment, dancing on top of warm cherries and cold, sweet cream. If you served this up at the dinner table, your guests would go quiet and then gasp, guaranteed. It looked like the height of elegance. Glossy cherries glistening in a rich sauce, steam curling up from the cold cream beneath, served in coupe glasses and silver bowls if you were being extra fancy. The warm and cold contrast made it indulgent, like something from a hotel restaurant in New York, not your neighbor's kitchen in Des Moines. It was actually dreamed up by Auguste Escoffier in honor of Queen Victoria's Jubilee back in the late 1800s. But it hit its stride in America during the 50s and 60s when tableside flambeing became the gold standard of posh entertaining. Think Bananas Foster, Steak Diane, flame meant flair. Cherries, Jubilee is sweet and slightly boozy but not overwhelming. The cherries kept their bite, the sauce was sticky and warm, and the ice cream melted just enough to swirl into everything like cream in a hot cherry pie. It felt rich, looked luxurious, and tasted like celebration. And the best part is that it wasn't expensive. You could use canned cherries and syrup and whatever brandy you had on hand. Cheap stuff did the trick just fine. Vanilla ice cream? Store brand worked just as well. It combined two things people love, fire and dessert. Serve something on fire and you've won the night. This one was a staple of every holiday table from about 1965 on. The pineapple cheese ball was the unsung hero of the hors d'oeuvres table, right next to the Ritz crackers and deviled eggs, always surrounded by compliments and recipe requests. It started with a base of cream cheese, softened and whipped until smooth. Into that went crushed pineapple, chopped green bell pepper, a little onion, and a handful of chopped pecans or walnuts. Throw in a dash of garlic salt, a splash of Worcestershire, and then roll it into a ball, chilled, and coat it in more nuts for a nice textured crust. Set it on a plate, surround it with crackers or celery sticks. And there it would sit, creamy, golden flecked, and beaming with retro charm. The look was inviting, rustic but intentional, like something you made with care. The taste was pure nostalgia, tangy from the pineapple, creamy from the cheese, with a little crunch and bite from the nuts and onions. It straddled the line between savory and sweet in a way that made people keep going back for just one more cracker's worth. This type of cheese ball came out of the Southern Party circuit and spread fast through church cookbooks and home economics magazines. It was cheap to make. You needed 1 block of cream cheese, a can of pineapple, and whatever you had on hand for seasoning. It was a little exotic. I mean, pineapple and cheese? But hey, it was incredibly satisfying. To me, it tasted like the holidays. 1 ball fed a room, which gave you all the more reason to invite more of your friends over. Charlotte Russe was dessert with a touch of European sophistication, brought down to earth by American practicality. If you've got lady fingers in your pantry, then have a go at this delight of a pudding. With those lady fingers, line the sides and bottom of a mold. Fill it to the brim with Bavarian cream or whipped gelatin custard, and crown it with a cherry or some swirls of whipped cream. It should hold itself like a little tower of elegance. And when you slice into it, you get soft cake against cool, fluffy filling. It looked like something from a window display at a fancy downtown bakery. Tall, tidy, and often served in individual portions for that extra touch of class. The layered effect gave it visual drama. And if you used cherry or raspberry gelatin in the filling, you'd get these pale pink swirls that caught the light just right. The original idea came from 19th century French cuisine, named either for Queen Charlotte of England or the Russian Tsarina, depending on who's telling the story. But it was American home cooks in the 1940s and 50s who turned it into a dessert that's both affordable and repeatable. Instead of rich custards and specialized molds, they used store-bought ladyfingers, Jell-O, and Dream Whip or evaporated milk whipped into fluff. It should taste light and creamy, slightly sweet, with that soft, spongy bite from the cake. It wasn't overly rich, which made it perfect for following a heavier meal. You could flavor the filling with lemon, strawberry, vanilla, whatever you had on hand. It made Mom look like she spent all day on it when really it was mostly assembly and a bit of fridge time. A few ladyfingers and some whipped gelatin went a long way. It was dessert as a centerpiece. Affordable, accessible, and always met with oohs and ahs when you brought it out. Chicken a la king in puff pastry shells, technically called vol au vent, looked fancy enough for company, but didn't cost much more than a rotisserie chicken and a bit of roux. In short, it was dinner party gold, and it didn't take much time and money to make. You'd start with diced cooked chicken, sautéed mushrooms, and sometimes peas or pimentos. All that got folded into a creamy white sauce. Just butter, flour, milk or cream, and a pinch of bouillon or sherry. Then came the puff pastry. Golden, flaky shells you could either buy frozen or make if you were ambitious. Though most of us just bought them. The sauce would be spooned generously into those warm pastry shells just before serving. On the dinner table, it had this regal look to it. Regal. Flaky golden crowns filled with steaming, creamy chicken. Maybe with a parsley sprig if you really wanted to show off. As for flavor, it was rich and buttery, a combination that I always found comforting. The chicken soaked up that sauce. The mushrooms gave it a savory edge, and the pastry brought crunch and a little airiness to each bite. It was the kind of meal that filled you up without weighing you down. The dish originated in high-end hotel kitchens. Some trace it to Delmonico's in New York. But by the middle of the 20th century, it had been fully adopted by home cooks. It impressed guests because it felt European, like something out of a Parisian bistro. But it was thrift under the hood, made with leftover chicken, basic pantry ingredients, and frozen pastry shells you kept on hand for moments just like this. Serve it with a little rice pilaf or some green beans, and you had yourself a showstopper that didn't break the bank. Strawberry pretzel salad was a picnic favorite that worked like a charm on the dinner table. Despite the name, it wasn't a salad in the leafy greens sense. This was a layered dessert, plain and simple, but with a quirky Midwestern spirit that made it perfect for potlucks, holiday tables, or anytime you wanted to turn a few cheap ingredients into something that looked and tasted like a celebration. The base was made up of crushed pretzels mixed with butter and a bit of sugar, pressed into a crust and baked till golden and crisp. That gave it the salty sweet crunch. Then came a layer of whipped topping mixed with softened cream cheese and sugar. Creamy, tangy, smooth. On top of that was strawberry jello poured over sliced strawberries and chilled until firm. That bright red gelatin top, studded with real berries, shimmered like stained glass. It looked like a festive slice of something much fancier than it was. 3 crisp, creamy, and fruity layers stacked in neat squares or scooped out into bowls. The ensemble was a delight to devour. You got sweet and salty, creamy and cool, with that fresh burst of berry in every bite. The clashing of the buttery pretzel crust with the whipped layer and jiggly jello made it fun to eat and memorable, especially for kids. This dish really came into popularity in the 1960s and 70s, mostly across the Midwest. It showed up in every church cookbook and family reunion, and you could make it all with things from the supermarket: store-brand jello, frozen whipped topping, a bag of pretzels, cream cheese, and a carton of strawberries if they were in season, frozen if not. Despite being easy and affordable, it looked like a lot of effort to whip up. The layers made your guests think you'd been working all day. But the truth was, it was all about timing and a little chilling. Try it out at your next gathering. If you want a salad that's a bit more green, here's Watergate salad. This bowl of fluff was a staple of cookouts, Easter buffets, and just about every 70s Tupperware party you can imagine. It's got a name that makes folks shake their heads, but it's all sweetness and light once it hits the spoon. The salad part is a stretch. It's more of a dessert in disguise. Instant pistachio pudding mix was the star, stirred together with canned crushed pineapple, juice and all, whipped topping and mini marshmallows. Sometimes you'd throw in chopped pecans or walnuts for texture. Mix it all up and chill it till it's set. The result was a light green, fluffy cloud speckled with bits of pineapple and soft marshmallows. It wasn't flashy in the plated sense, but it looked intriguing. I mean, how can it not be with its retro and pastel tints? It looked like something out of a 1970s homemaker magazine. The flavor was sweet but not too rich. That pistachio pudding gave it a nutty, creamy base, and the pineapple brought a tangy punch. The marshmallows softened overnight, becoming little puffs that melted into the mix. It was a weirdly wonderful combination that somehow worked. Cool, creamy, a little crunchy, a little chewy. It got its name while the whole Watergate scandal was going on, though nobody agrees exactly how. It might have started with a Washington, D.C. hotel dish, or just been a clever bit of naming at the height of the political drama. What mattered more was that it was cheap and easy. 1 box of pudding, a can of fruit, a tub of whipped topping, and some marshmallows. You could make a whole bowl of it for just a few dollars. Green fluff on the table stood out. People never forgot it, and when they tasted it, they kept going back for seconds. It made you look like you had a little culinary secret up your sleeve, when all you really needed was a mixing bowl and a fridge. When you can't afford real duck, try mock duck, one of those clever old dishes that moms pulled together when the budget was tight. But the occasion called for something a little fancier. Don't let the name fool you. No duck involved, not even a feather. What it was, though, was a thrifty, showy little trick made with thinly sliced beef or flank steak, stuffed, rolled, and baked till tender and proud. You'd start with a piece of steak pounded out thin, cheap cuts usually, since they'd tenderize during the long bake. On top, you'd spread a savory stuffing of breadcrumbs, chopped onion, celery, herbs, mixed with a little egg to bind it. Then you'd roll it all up like a jelly roll. Tie it with kitchen string or pin it with toothpicks. Brown it in a skillet, then let it bake low and slow in a little broth or tomato sauce. When it came out, slice it into neat little rounds. It's a gorgeous pinwheel display of seasoned filling wrapped in juicy beef. It looked like something you'd get in a restaurant, and it had presents. Pour a little gravy ladled over top and take your taste buds on a ride. Mock duck was hearty, meaty, and comforting. The stuffing soaked up the juices, and every bite gave you that warm Sunday dinner flavor, even on a Tuesday. It wasn't duck, no, but it had a richness and a formality that made guests feel special. This dish has roots in Depression-era cooking, and even earlier when home cooks had to stretch a small amount of meat into a meal that looked like more. It stuck around through the 40s and 50s because it felt generous and refined without costing much. If you can't have luxury, why not mimic it? Your guests wouldn't know they were eating a 79-cent cut of beef and day-old bread. What they saw was a rolled roast sliced into medallions, maybe garnished with parsley and flanked by roasted carrots. It was thrift and theater in one. If you feel like you don't have enough pinwheeled food on the table, serve your mock duck next to these deviled ham pinwheels. This right here is a classic little appetizer that looked delicate and refined. But underneath it all, they were made with some of the cheapest stuff in the pantry. And that was the beauty of it. They let you serve something that felt like a canapé at a fancy cocktail party, even if you whipped it up in 10 minutes with a can opener. Here's what it was: soft white sandwich bread with crusts trimmed off, flattened with a rolling pin until it was thin and pliable. You'd spread a layer of deviled ham across the surface. If you want to do as the Romans do, grab a tin of Underwood deviled ham and use that for this dish. Spice it with a little mustard, vinegar, salt, and pepper. Nothing fancy, but it packed a punch. Then you'd roll it all up tight like a jelly roll, chill it to firm it up, and slice it into neat spirals. Secure each piece with a toothpick, or garnish it with an olive slice or sprig of parsley. They're supposed to look like little pink and white swirls, dainty, uniform, and tidy on a serving tray. They had that clean, retro cocktail party vibe, compact, presentable, and easy to eat with your fingers and a napkin. Taste-wise, they were creamy, a little tangy, and savory in that way only canned deviled ham can be. The white bread balanced out the saltiness, and if you added a bit of cream cheese or butter to stretch the filling, it mellowed the flavor just enough. This dish showed up a lot in the 50s and 60s when convenience foods were king and entertaining was about efficiency with flair. Canned meats were a staple in many American households, and turning them into hors d'oeuvres was just how it was done then. Despite its simplicity, deviled ham pinwheels looked intentional and refined. Even though the ingredients cost next to nothing, the presentation said, "I put in the effort." The pinwheel shape gave it visual flair, and the salty, tangy taste held its own next to whatever punch bowl or whiskey sours were floating around the room. They were cheap, they were cheerful, and they made a tray look full and festive. Can't ask for much more from a pantry classic. Now, if your table's still missing a little visual drama, the meatloaf cake with mashed potato icing was your best bet. This was part prank, part genius. Taking the humble meatloaf and dressing it up to look like dessert, what could be more American? This surprise of a dish started like any meatloaf, with ground beef or whatever ground meat was on sale. Mix in some breadcrumbs, eggs, onions, ketchup, or tomato soup for moisture. But instead of shaping it into a loaf, you'd pack it into round cake pans, just like a layer cake. Once baked and cooled slightly, you'd stack the layers with mashed potatoes between them like frosting. Then you'd ice the whole thing with more whipped potatoes, smooth the sides, and sometimes even pipe rosettes with a star tip if you were feeling cheeky. A sprinkle of parsley or paprika on top gave it the final touch. It looked like a birthday cake. No joke. White, fluffy, frosting, tiered structure, neat edges. But slice into it and surprise. It's meat. The taste was exactly what you'd expect. A good old-fashioned meatloaf with buttery mashed potatoes in every bite. Savory, filling, and oddly fun to eat. This idea popped up in mid-century cookbooks and homemaker magazines as a way to turn a basic dinner into a conversation piece. It took the ordinary and made it festive. And again, cheap ingredients just presented with a wink and a little effort. It caught everyone's attention with how it played with expectations. You served it, folks blinked, then laughed, then went in for seconds. It was novelty but not nonsense. Kids had fun with it, adults talked about it, and the hostess looked like a creative genius, all while stretching a pound or two of ground beef into a dinner and a conversation. Funny how a little meatloaf cake or a swirl of deviled ham could make you feel like you were dining in high style, isn't it? Now, I want to hear from you. What flashy, frugal dish do you remember showing off back in the day? Let's swap stories and recipes in the comments below. And if you enjoyed watching, subscribe to Memory Manor for more. Thanks for dropping by.